Okay, so this is question 6 of the GCSE Computer Science Edexcel board paper for 2026, and the scenario is a skateboarding scenario and various bits of data that we'll get into in a moment, and these are the instructions that we need to do. The first one is to display first name and last name, total score and a trick rating. Now the first thing we need to do is open up Q06PY and then save it straight away as Q06 finished. That means we can go back and reopen the source file if we need to go back to the beginning for some reason. Hopefully that won't be necessary. And here is the source footage that's been provided for us, the source code, and you can see I've saved it as Q06 finished. I haven't made any changes yet. We've got a 2D list here, so a list of lists. Okay, so it looks like we've got first name here, last name, and various bits of data that we'll obviously have to get into. So here you can see I've highlighted the beginning of this question, so it's always good to start simple and then build up. So let's display the last name. The comment here tells us which element is the last name, so the order is that it starts last name, then first name, then we've got 2 course runs, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tricks. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's start off by just displaying the last name. So before we get into that, let's just remind ourselves using a simpler example of how 2D lists work. So if I wanted to print an element from this list, how would I do it? So what do you think the output is in this example? So we've got a list called my list, and it's a 2D list because I've got a bracket at the beginning and a bracket at the end. I've forgotten a comma here, which I often do. And then it's a list of lists. 2D lists are a list of lists, so each sublist has 2 elements in it. So if I wanted to output Bob, what would I do? Okay, will this output Bob? Let's test it and see. Okay, so it outputs the whole sublist. This is sublist 0, this is sublist 1, this is sublist 2. So if I wanted to output Bob, the first lot of square brackets on line 7 identifies the sublist, and the second identifies the element in this sublist that I want to display. Okay, so now it's outputting Bob, and if I wanted to output Howard instead, the last name, I would change this to 1. And how could we make it so that it output the last name of every person in this sublist? Well, we could do print, but that's not very efficient, so let's use a for loop instead. So here we have a for loop. Remember, for loops automatically increment this x, make it go up by 1 each time until it gets to 3. So it starts at 0 and keep going until it gets to 3. So we can use that variable here. So on the first loop, there will be a 0 here. So 0, 0 means it'll output Bob. Then it will loop. There'll be a 1 here, so it'll be 1, 0. So it'll output Sean. And then on the third loop, it'll be 2. So there'll be a 2 here, so it'll output Grace. Okay, but we don't want to output the first names, we want to output the last names. So this selects the sublist, and this selects the element in the sublist, and they start at 0, so 0 and 1. So if we change this to 1, it will output the surnames. Right, so let's go back to our actual question. Okay, let's pause the screen for a second, and before we carry on, can you output a print statement using a for loop that outputs the surname? So for x in range. Now, how many times do we want this to loop? Well, we can use len and the name of the list, and then it will loop however many times there are sublists in this list. Okay, so now we can use this X to print last name and first name. So if we print, and then we need to output the sublist, and then we want to output the last name, and then we want to, well, let's see whether that works before we carry on. Okay, so that is outputting the last name of every single competitor in this list. Now, no doubt you are aware that we don't just want to display last name and first name, we also need to display total score. But what is total score? Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is get rid of this print statement, because that was just a tester really. So here you can see I've added a new variable called record, and on each loop of this for loop it will store the sublist currently being used, okay, being viewed, and we need that because we need to work out which of these two course runs is the highest. Now let's just have a look to see if that is working properly. So I'm going to print what has been stored into this variable. So this tells me that I am storing the sublist each time the for loop iterates, because it's printing it out. Let's get rid of that, we don't need it anymore. So the next step is to use this and to call a function that will work out the highest of the two values, and then it will return a value. So I'm going to create a new variable called highest course run, HCR, and then each time that iterates it's going to assign a value to that variable. So I need to decompose this problem into a subroutine. So let's call that subroutine high course, and we need to pass in the sublist that's been stored into this record variable. Okay, so this is calling the function, and whatever this function does will be returned into this variable here. So now we need to define that function, so let's do that up here. Right, so remember we need to now in this function look at these values and return the highest of them. So can you pause that now and then write in this function the code that you need to actually work out which of these two is highest, and then return it so it gets assigned to here. Okay, hopefully your solution looked a little bit like this one here. You've got a function called high course that's going to work out which of these two is the highest value on each iteration when it is called down here. So we set an initial value for the highest course run, okay, lowest possible value, and then we compare record index 2, record index 3. Remember, record is storing the sublist currently being looked at, so we don't look at the 2D list directly, and it is looking at this element and this element. Okay, so it decides which one is the highest, and then it assigns the highest one to HCR, and then it returns HCR, which means HCR gets stored here. And we can just test this is working. Always a good idea to test as you go. So let's print HCR, and it is outputting 86 on the first iteration and 58 on the second iteration. And if we look at our data, this is 86 is the highest of the two values in the first sublist, and 58 is the highest of the two values in the second sublist. Now we don't need this print statement, we were just using it for testing purposes, so I'm going to get rid of it. And now we can move on to the next step to work out total score. Remember, total score is calculated by adding up the highest of these two values with the highest of these two values. So it would be 86 plus 91 for Bryce, and it would be 58 plus 97 for Dora. So that is what we need to be doing. So we now have a function that works out for us which of these is the two highest. So we now need another function to work out which is the highest of these 5 trick scores. So let's create a new variable, and I'm going to call it highest trick score, and I'm going to call a function called high trick, and we can pass in this record again like we did before, so that it can look at the last 5 elements and return the highest trick score from those 5 elements on each of these sublists. And that will give us variables for the highest course run and the highest trick score, which will allow us to work out a total score. So having called this function, we now need to actually make the function. So as before, we need to define the function. And can you now set an initial value for the highest trick score, and then can you compare the 5 elements in the 5 to return a value which is the highest of these 5 values? And this is my solution. So I've got a for loop. It's got 2 values here because it is basically iterating through the 4th element to the 9th element. So x starts at 4, and what this is saying is that if the current value for highest trick score, which is 0, is less than the one being looked at, then it will update it with the new value. So not the 0, it gets overwritten, it gets assigned a new value, and it will iterate through each one of these 5 elements until it finds the highest one and assigns it to here, and then it will return that value. So that's been returned using call and return, saved into here. So let's just print again, testing as we go to see if that is working. Of course I've got to spell print correctly, so let's try that. Okay, so I've made a mistake somewhere. I've just made a mistake with the naming of the function where it's being defined. So let's try that again. So 91, 97, 87. So if we see here, of these last 5 elements, 91 is the highest. Of these 5 elements, 97 is the highest. So 91, 97 is correct. And let's just do one more check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 87 is the highest of these. So we now have a returned value giving us a highest course record score and highest trick score, which allows us to now work out a total score. Okay, so having now made functions that return the value for the highest course record and a function that returns a value for the highest trick score, we don't need this print. We can now add those two together to give us a total score But then what do? We're going to need to store that information somewhere. So I've appended it to the end of each sublist. One problem I had earlier is initially I had it iterating between 4 and 8. So what was happening there? So these are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But when I stopped at 8, it wouldn't actually look at the last element. So that had to be changed to 9. So the question text tells us to display this information. So I've now added a print statement that outputs the name, so last name, first name, and this is the appended total score that has just been written into the sublist here. So when we run it, it now outputs the last name, the first name, and the total score. Right, so the next thing we need to do is work out the trick rating, and we could use min and max for that, and actually there's been a lot of comment on the internet about whether we should or shouldn't use that, but it isn't in the PLS, so I'm not going to use min and max for it. But we are going to, yes, you guessed it, we are going to use a function. So the trick rating is worked out using working out what the lowest and the highest of these trick scores are, and then working out the mean. So you do that by adding them together and dividing by 2. So let's make a function that does that for us. So this is our 2D list that we've been using. This is the function that works out the which of the highest of these two course runs is, and this function here looks at the last 5 elements here, which are the trick scores, to work out what the highest trick score is, and returns that value. So don't get confused between the highest trick score function and the highest trick rating function. This returns the highest trick score, and this function is going to return a mean average, which takes the lowest trick score and the highest trick score, adds them together, and then divides them by 2. That's the mean average, and that's what needs to be returned. So what I suggest, this is here so that we can look at each sublist one at a time, just as we have before, and we already have the highest trick score. So you might be like, well, how's it remembering that? Well, remember, it's working through, in this main program, it's working through each of these each time. So on each loop, it's updating for the current record being looked at, the HCR and the HTS. Okay, so that does make sense. And then we can use that, we don't have to redo it, we can use the highest trick score. So this function needs to work out what the lowest trick score is, and then perform that sum, adding the lowest trick score and the highest trick score together and dividing by 2, and returning the trick rating. So I suggest you pause the video now and you write a function that will work out what the lowest trick score is and then return a value which is the trick rating. And here we have it. So as before, we set an initial value for the lowest trick score, and it's been deliberately set to be very high. 1,000 is probably much too high. There's nothing. The 100 I think is the highest here, so you could have probably gone a digit smaller. But anyway, so we've got a lowest trick score with a deliberately high initial value, and then we are iterating through each of the elements in the current record, and it's trying to work out what the lowest of the scores is. So previously we worked out the highest, and now we need to work out the lowest so that we can work out the mean average. Okay, so when it's worked out what the lowest one is, it's assigned to LTS, and then the trick rating is the highest trick score plus the lowest trick score divided by 2. That gives us the mean average, and then we return that. Now at the moment we haven't actually called this function, so we need to write a variable and then assign this returned value to that variable. So we've got our function, and this is our main program, and on each loop it works out what the highest course run is and what the highest trick score is, and we've got a total score. So where do you think we should call this function? And don't forget that, as with this, for example, the highest trick score, we have a variable and then the function is called and it returns a value to this variable. So where do you think we should do that? We need somewhere in here, we need it to call this function and then return a trick rating. So pause the video, have a go at updating this for loop in your main program, and then we'll continue. Right, so we can see here that I've got a variable to store the trick rating, and this is where the function is called. We pass in the data that we need, and then that function returns a value to this variable, and we can then use that variable in our print statement so that we're displaying the information that we need. So these are the objectives we've achieved so far. So we are displaying last name, first name, total score and trick rating, but we're doing that for every single competitor at the moment, and we're only supposed to display that information for the competitors who've been awarded a certificate. So the next step is to have a function that works out which competitors have been awarded a certificate. So let's have a look at the criteria for being awarded a certificate. So the question paper says that competitors who achieve a course run score of greater than 90 or equal to and have a trick rating of 100 or higher, or an overall trick rating of greater than 70. So there's a lot going on there, because they have to have both a course score of greater than or equal to 90 or one of these two. So let's try and understand this by looking at the first sublist. So Bryce here, these two values here are his course score. So his highest course score is 86. So poor Bryce doesn't get a certificate because it's not greater than or equal to 90. Now his trick scores are these ones here, and he doesn't have a trick score of greater than or equal to 100, so he doesn't succeed on that front either. But just out of interest, what's his trick rating? Well, if we run our program, we can see the trick rating is here. So on that criteria, he doesn't get a certificate again, because although it's 70, it has to be greater than 70. Now initially I thought I might need to make a function for this, but actually you probably don't need to do that. So before the print statement, we could have an if statement that only runs this command if the criteria listed here are correct. So can you do that now? Can you write an if statement that checks whether the competitor has actually achieved these criteria, and then if it does achieve those criteria, then it will run this line of code. So our first criteria was for a certificate was the course run score had to be at least 90. So that's what I've done here. In the main program, in the for loop, if the highest course run score is greater than or equal to 90, it will run this print statement. Now this second bullet point's a little bit more confusing because it has an OR in it as well. So it's got to either have a trick score of 100 or an overall trick rating of greater than 70. So note the nested if statement here. So our first if is the course run score greater than or equal to 90? Now if that is the case, it will then ask a follow-up question. It's an OR question, so is the trick score, the highest trick score, greater than or equal to 100, or is the overall trick rating greater than 70? Now if those criteria are met, it will run the print statement. So let's run it and test it. So we have 3 competitors output with as having received certificates. Okay, so looking back at the question paper, we can see that we've achieved this first bullet point. So now we can look at the next task, displaying the name and higher course run score and some other data relating to the total score of the gold medal winner. So we need to look a bit closer about who is a gold medal winner. So the gold medal winner is the competitor with the highest total score, and we're quite lucky because we have actually got a variable for total score and we appended that value to the 2D list. Now we can just double check that we do have that total score value appended by printing the current record being looked at. So if we do something like this, we should see that it's adding the total score to the end of every competitor's record. So I'm just going to undo this command again because we don't want to add extra things. We're not supposed to do that. But we need to just double check that we've got the right element index. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So the total score is in element 9. Now what we can do is we've got this working. We don't really want to muck around with that anymore. So let's just do something after it's output the information that we needed to do for the first bullet point in the question paper. So we're going to start hunting for our gold medalist, searching through that 9th index element, with an index of 9, down here. And let's set an initial value for the gold medalist. Okay, so let's just assume that the first sublist, the first person is the gold medalist. So this assumes that Bryce is our gold medalist, but clearly this competitor isn't. There are other people with a higher total score. So how can we update this gold variable to associate it with the person with the highest rating? So I've started you off. We've got a for loop which is going to iterate through the whole sublist, and it's going to look at that total score element, and you need to do an if statement that checks to see if the person who is currently assigned to gold does have the highest total score. And if it doesn't, you will need to update this variable with the new sublist. So pause it, have a go, and then we'll have a look at a solution. Okay, this is my solution. Not quite finished, and spoiler alert, we've got a few problems. So if we run it, well, before we run it, so we've got a for loop that will iterate through the whole of the list, and we're using I to select a sublist and identify the 9th element, which is the one with the total score. So gold contains the whole of the sublist, so it would 0 is this sublist, so it contains everything. So gold contains all of this. All right, and then it checks that if the 9th element in that list is less than the 9th element in the list being looked at, so it's iterating through the whole of these sublists, and if it's lower, if the current one is lower, it updates this variable with the new sublist, with the new competitor's details. So let's run it and see. I'm sure you did spot some of the problems. Okay, so the first problem is it's got a problem with line 58, and it's because I've obviously used the wrong type of brackets. Okay. Now the second problem is it's got a problem with int, and we've noticed earlier that the output for total score was a float value, so we need to convert cast to integer. So you can see I've now added int here, so that casts the float value to integer before it makes the comparison. Right, so, and the next issue that I had was a little confusing at first, because this looks right to me, but the error message is talking about line 60, and it worked out that the issue here, if we're updating gold with a whole sublist, because we've started with a whole sublist here, and now we're updating it with a single element in that sublist, that doesn't work. So if we take out that 9 so that gold is being updated with the whole sublist, the error message goes away. Don't forget to undo. So we need to see the output so we can actually confirm that this is all working as it should be. So I'm just going to print gold. Having gone through the whole of the iterative process, it should print out the... So here we go, we've got this person here. Let's check to see if she really is the gold medal winner. Okay, so this is the output from my program so far, and we can see clearly that it's printing the sublist of the person with the highest total score, and that is the gold medal winner. But they don't want us to just print out the sublist, they want us to display the first name, the last name, and some other information. So be aware that it's last name, first name, so they've swapped them over. Now the highest course run score, we can use the function we've already made for that. So these two values are the highest course run score. So we'll just pass in the gold to that subroutine, and it should tell us what the highest of these two are. And the same with the highest trick score. We've got a function that will compare through these 5 elements and tell us which one's the highest. And the total score has already been added to that sublist as well. So we now need to edit this print statement so it's displaying the right information. So let's start off with the simple stuff. At the moment we're printing out the whole of the sublist. Can you edit this so it prints out the last name and the first name in the order it wants here? So it needs to be the first name and the last name. Okay, so here you can see I've updated the print statement, and if I run it you can see it's outputting the names as so. So what else do we need to do? Well, we've got the first name and the last name, and so we need to work out what the highest course run score is in this sublist. So we've got 2 values here, and we can use the function. So can you create a new variable and then use the existing function to return a value, the highest of these two values? So here you can see I've added a call and return command that is before the print statement. So I've got a new variable. I'm using the old function, but I'm passing in the gold variable parameter, and that means I can then output what's been returned. So this is what's being used to work out which one of the two values is the highest. So if we run it, it is returning the higher of the two values. So what else do we need to include? So we've got first name, last name, and the course highest of the two course run scores. So now we need to do the same thing with the highest trick score. So you need to create a new variable and you need to use the existing function to work out what the highest trick score is and then include it in the print statement. Have a go now. So as before, we've got a new variable for the highest trick score for the gold sublist. So that's the variable. It calls the function we made before, passing in gold, and that returns the highest trick score. And then we can use that in a print statement. And if we run it, it has output a new value. It's a bit weird that there's two 100s, but we can see that if we look at the values for the highest trick score, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we can see 100 is indeed the highest value for the highest trick score, and this is the highest value for the course scores. So 100 and 100 is the correct output here. So what else do we need to do? So of all these instructions, we've done everything now except total score, and we already have total score stored in the, if you remember, we appended total score to the end of the sublist, so we just need to print the index element 9. And that's what you can see here in the print statement, and if we run it, you can see that it is outputting that 9th element for the sublist stored in gold. And we can see that we have now achieved all the objectives in this second bullet point. What else do we need to do? Well, we've achieved these two bullet points. So when it says work even if the number of records is changed, that is referring to if there were more sublists added, would it still iterate through them? Now, because we've used len instead of a fixed number of iterations, it then will automatically loop the correct number of times. So where is an example of that? Well, in our main program here, because we've used len, it will iterate for however many times however many sublists there are in the list. So I think we can say we've achieved this one as well. Now, using comments and whitespace is making sure that you have commented through your code, and it's easy points, and you can see I've been doing it to sort of add a bit more, but it's always worth checking that you've got neat paragraphs for your functions and it's not all one giant block of text. As I say, it's easy points, and it helps you when you're not understanding something and you're working through code under time pressure. It helps to have comments like these and gaps between your code. So I think we can say we have completed question 6. I hope you enjoyed it. Well done. So it's obviously all very well doing this as a practice exercise for our getting ready for doing GCSE exams. If you're one of the people that actually did do this in the exam, Remember that if you found it challenging, other people probably did too, and it's always pretty hard to work under a time pressure. I think there is a good case to be made for doing the higher value questions before you do the earlier questions, but obviously you'd need to sort of manage your time, and if you get to a point where you're just not going to get there, maybe consider doing some of the other questions and coming back to it if you can. Practice definitely makes perfect with these. I would suggest, if you haven't done so already, have a look at question 5. I've got a walkthrough of that as well, and it's pretty common to be using reading and writing data to a text file in these GCSE practical papers for the Edexcel Computer Science. So good luck, and please do comment if you have any questions or suggestions on how to do it better even.